Welcome to the Society of Labour Lawyers webinar for the Housing Group. My name is Rosalee, Dorfman, Mohajer. The title of this panel discussion is Leaseholders in Cladding, Unresolved Issues 3 years after the calamitous Grenfell fire. On the 14th of June, 3 years ago, the fire surged through Grenfell Tower and it scaled the external cladding at lightning speed. The image of that racing fire will be forever etched in our memories. Sadly, we lost 72 lives due to the fire and more than 70 people were injured. The Grenfell Tower Inquiry has published their Phase 1 report. However, the Phase 2 hearings have been paused due to coronavirus. Recently, it's been reported that around 2,000 buildings are still covered with flammable cladding, and many of the affected residents are leaseholders. They feel stuck, having to pay huge sums in service charges to have the dangerous cladding removed or pay for waking watches. The value of their properties have often plummeted, so they are unable to sell and move out. This evening, we have an excellent array of speakers to discuss these issues. First, Ritu Saha, co-founder of the UK Cladding Action Group and leaseholder affected by dangerous cladding. You may recently have seen her in the news, and she's published an article on the topic for the Legal Action magazine. Second, we have Justin Bates, barrister at Landmark Chambers and expert in service charges, as well as housing and leasehold issues. He's representing a number of Grenfell survivors at the Grenfell Inquiry. Last but not least, we have Assembly Member Andrew Dismore. He is a Society of Labour Lawyers member and London Assembly member for Barnet and Camden. He is the chair of the Fire Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee. So the plan for this evening is that each person will speak for about 10 minutes, and this will be followed by a Q&A session. If you could please have Ritu Saha speak first.
Thank you very much, Rosalie. Thank you for having me. So I just wanted to set out a little bit about our situation and talk a little bit about the issues as we leaseholders see them. So I'm a leaseholder at a building called North Point, a 10-story block in Bromley with 57 flats. I bought my flat in December of 2015. 2 years later, I found out that my building was covered with dangerous cladding, similar to that found on Grenfell, as well as other kinds of cladding. My building, it was built in the 60s as an office block, and it was converted into residential properties in the year 2000, and that's when the cladding was put on. The developer was taken over by Taylor Wimpey in 2001. And in 2008, Taylor Wimpey sold on the freehold to my current freeholder. Cladding remediation at North Point is expected to cost around £4 million. I was looking at a bill of about £75,000 personally. On top of this, the fire brigade insisted on a 2-person waking watch patrolling the building 24/7. Till date, this has cost the 57 flats at North Point about £420,000 and counting. We've also had to spend another £120,000 on an interim fire alarm system. We are still paying £11,000 per month on a fire patrol. And my personal additional bill for just interim safety measures, just so I can stay in my home, has been £14,000 till date and counting. On top of this, we've also found out that our building, like many others, have got lots of internal fire safety defects, the primary one being lack of fire breaks or compartmentation, which is also going to cost several hundreds of thousands of pounds to fix. Under leasehold law, the financial burden of fixing all of these defects, including external cladding, rests solely with me, the leaseholder, who has absolutely nothing to do with creating these defects in the first place. And we do not own the building. My story is very similar to the story of hundreds of thousands of leaseholders across the country who are waking up to the fact that our homes are fundamentally unsafe. Except in some cases where the developer is paying to fix these issues simply to protect their reputation rather than because of a legal obligation, or the lucky few that have been able to claim under a building warranty, in all other cases, leaseholders are being held liable, often by means of a first-tier tribunal. In March of 2019, I got together with two other leaseholders in Sheffield and London, and we formed the UK Cladding Action Group. And our main aim was to actually bring together leaseholders from across the country who were facing these issues. We wanted to get together. It was entirely due to the pressure from these leaseholder groups like ours and others across the country and inside housing and some wonderful supporters that the government finally launched the £200 million private ACM cladding fund in May of 2019, nearly 2 years after the Grenfell disaster. Unfortunately, this left all other dangerous cladding out of scope, like HPL. Yet more campaigning led to another £1 billion fund being announced by the government in March of this year. And this extended the scope to other kinds of dangerous cladding only. The recent Housing Communities and Local Government Select Committee inquiry on cladding has shown the scale of the problem across the country. And this report estimates that it will cost at least £15 billion to fix fire safety defects in high-rise and high-risk blocks. There have been actually a litany of issues caused by the cladding crisis, and the vast majority of these boil down to two things. One is the decades of poor building regulations in this country, spanning across all political parties, and the current laws of the land, which are not in favor of leaseholders. Leasehold law means that there is only one party in the majority of cases that has the legal and financial responsibility for fixing these defects. And that's the party that had nothing to do with creating these defects in the first place, us, the leaseholders. Freeholders can bill leaseholders hundreds of thousands of pounds for cladding remediation, and we have the threat of forfeiture and the loss of our homes if we do not pay immediately. The statute of limitations on building defects also means that for a vast majority of these buildings, developers can no longer be held liable or responsible for these defects. Even in newer buildings, getting the warranty providers to pay out has become a huge uphill battle, with the providers using every legal loophole to get out of paying. Unfortunately, since Grenfell, some of the measures taken by the government have actually made things even worse. From December of 2018, the government introduced new guidance and advice notes on building safety. The strange thing is that while most guidance and regulations will come into force from the time they are announced, these regulations were applied on already existing buildings. And the retrospective application of these regulations have really had disastrous consequences for the housing market in the country. And the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, they created an external wall survey form called EWS. I believe it was intended for surveyors to have a standard way of evaluating the external walls of buildings, which are over 18 meters high. Unfortunately, the mortgage industry, taking into account these changing advice notes from the government, and having completely lost faith in the building safety standards in this country caused by poor building regulations, they have now started insisting on these forms for buildings which are of any height. There aren't enough surveyors in the market to carry out surveys necessary on these thousands of blocks. Surveyors are unwilling to sign up these forms because they're not being able to get professional indemnity insurance cover. Leaseholders who've been on the verge of selling their flats have suddenly found out that they'll have to put their lives on hold for between 2 to 5 years just to find out whether their buildings are safe or not. The market for the sale and remortgage of flats is completely ground to a halt, and this has led, I'm sure, to a massive loss of revenue from stamp duty as well for the government. Unfortunately, the insurance industry has also started cashing in on this crisis. Buildings with cladding have seen their insurance premiums rocket by as much as 10 times, and these crippling costs are being borne solely by leaseholders. And one of the greatest travesties of justice, the government, recognizing that 1 billion is not enough to even touch the surface of the scale of the problem, they have announced that the new Building Safety Fund is going to be administered on a first-come, first-served basis. Not only do we feel that this is a real grave discrimination amongst leaseholders who are facing the same issues, a first-come, first-served approach to the safety of human lives, to prevent lives from being lost in a fire, that should really, I mean, it should shock and horrify any civilized society. So I would ask anybody from the Society of Labour Lawyers to check the legality of such an approach and whether this breaches any of our human rights, such as the right to life. The government has come up with a solution, and that's the fire safety bill. Unfortunately, this bill makes no mention of who is going to pay to fix fire safety defects. Building owners are legally responsible for building safety. They're also legally allowed, and in some cases indeed required, to pass the costs of fixing these defects onto leaseholders. The fire safety bill is obviously silent on this front, and that really means that the issues of this cladding crisis are not going to go away very quickly. The fire safety bill has also made no mention of the responsibilities of developers who currently have built all of these dangerous buildings with impunity, and they continue to get off scot-free. We hope that the upcoming building safety bill is going to focus on the legal aspect of who is financially responsible for paying to fix these buildings and make them safe. We hope it's going to focus on the role of developers, and we hope it is going to make sure that leaseholders are protected from these costs. The legal loopholes that currently allow developers to dissolve, to spring up as new entities, sell on the freeholds, and use other completely legal measures to absolve themselves of responsibilities for the blocks that they have built, these legal loopholes must be closed. And finally, looking at the bigger picture, the building safety laws must make those who are responsible for failures of building safety financially responsible for fixing these failures. Currently, the laws as they stand do not make this the case. When you're considering all of these aspects, I really hope everybody was going to spare a thought for the impact that this crisis has had on the mental health of the people who are living through this daily nightmare. There are over 500,000 people who are trapped in unsafe high-rise blocks, and there are millions more in unsafe mid-rise blocks. We did a survey earlier this year, which was filled out by 550 people. 90% said that their mental health had deteriorated when they found out about cladding issues. 23% said that they had thoughts of suicide or self-harm. The impact of the loss of control of our lives and of our financial future, it simply cannot be put into words. We are living in danger every day. And on top of that, we've been forced to write a blank check to fix the failures of others. And we face losing our homes if we do not write out these blank checks. And coronavirus is actually a very good parallel. During lockdown, people lost their freedom. The leaseholders who are trapped in the cladding scandal have actually lost their freedom. And we are trapped in this nightmare for 3 years, and there's really not been any escape. I see that there are only two solutions: more government funding and a change of the laws to make sure that this situation does not happen again. And obviously, it's with regards to the second part that your listeners will come in. I would really urge you all to do your bit to make sure that the law changes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ritu, for that very comprehensive overview of the horrific situation facing leaseholders at this time. Thank you. So if we can now have Justin Bates speak. Thanks.
Am I now unmuted? Yes, I see I am. Right, excellent. Just three little things before I dive into my part of the talk. I'm not presently acting for anyone in the Grenfell inquiry. I was acting for some of the families in phase 1, but I stopped after phase 1. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, this is a really tough topic for lawyers because, as Ritu's just explained, the law can't really provide a proper solution here. And it's a great failing of the law and the legal system that we can't really give people a clear answer to how they get through this mess. And I'm very aware, I've heard Ritu speak before, we've met in the past, I'm very aware that this is a difficult topic for lawyers because we inevitably start turning our discussion into things like limitation periods and defective premises claims and such like. And the reality is this is affecting tens of thousands of people in a way that very few of us, I suspect, can understand. I mean, to give you an idea of the scale of the problem, the Select Committee report from the Communities and Local Government Select Committee that came out about a fortnight ago thinks there's probably around 2,000 buildings in England with some kind of fire safety problem on them. which means we're talking tens of thousands of flats and occupiers, where people are living in buildings that they either have ACM cladding, which is the Grenfell cladding, or they have HPL cladding. HPL is effectively very small bits of wood that have been meshed together to make cladding. Or they have no fire breaks, they have no fire doors. If they have fire breaks, people have left rubbish in them, so they no longer serve as a fire break. The scale of the problem and the nature of the problem is vast. And it's also a worldwide problem. This is not a uniquely English and Welsh problem. Scotland's a bit different. I can talk about Scotland a bit later on if you want to, but Scotland's not quite as bad as us. The other country that's got a massive problem with cladding problems and fire safety is Australia, where they're about 5 years ahead of us in terms of the impact of their disastrous cladding issues. They had their Grenfell situation about 5 years before us. And Australia does give us some idea for what the reforms that you need to see take place might look like. But in terms of the law, the problems really exist at 3 levels. The first is identifying who's responsible for the building being in this condition. The second is identifying who's going to put it right. And the third is who pays for it. And there aren't really any good answers to any of those 3 questions. The first one, whose fault is it that buildings are in this condition? There's a range of possible targets. One is the government. Any of you who followed the Grenfell Inquiry Phase 1 report will have seen that the line that lots of the corporate participants took is that the regulations, building regulations, were either unclear or they complied with them. And the government's line is that they were perfectly clear and you did not comply with them. And there is this real difficulty that the industry and the government seem to have interpreted regulations very differently for a long period of time. And there are quite powerful arguments to be made that the government either didn't update its guidance properly, it's what's called Approved Document B, for those of you who really follow this stuff, either didn't update Approved Document B properly, or simply turned a blind eye to the problems that we all knew were developing. If you don't want to blame the government, do you want to try and blame the builder? After all, you would think that someone who put flammable cladding on the outside of a building should be responsible for it. The difficulty with this, again, is twofold. Builders say, well, we complied with the regulations. How were we to know that this wasn't provided for? Approved Document B allowed a reading that was permissible to have ACM cladding or HPL cladding. But perhaps more importantly, in terms of structural legal problems, most builders build through shell companies. I'll choose them as an example. This is not to blame them particularly, but you see, for example, someone like, say, a Galliard Homes, a big developer. It'll be Galliard Homes Special Purpose Built Vehicle number 1 that builds the block of flats, and it will ensure that all the money goes back to Galliard Homes Special Purpose Vehicle number 2, which then pays the money on to Galliard Homes proper. That structure whereby builders build through special purpose vehicles is very, very common. There are good reasons for it, there are bad reasons for it, but it's very common. And what it means is, at the end of the building, you just wind up the company that did the building, so even if it did do anything wrong, there's nothing you can do about it. We then have another problem for the builder, of course, which is even if they still exist, you've got a limitation claim. And we'll talk about this a bit later on, but basically the problem is you've got 6 years from the date of the defect, not the date of the knowledge, or if you're going for a Defective Premises Act claim, 6 years from the date of the final sign-off. And most of these buildings were built more than 6 years ago. The third person you might try and blame is the building inspector, but you can't win that argument below the Supreme Court. There are, as a House of Lords authority, Merton Borough Council and Anne's, I'm sure you all remember from lectures on tort law, that you can't bring claims against the local authority's building inspector. And then there's a similar one from the Court of Appeal last year, which holds that you can't go against the private building inspector either. So you don't have claims against building inspectors. So there's your first problem. Who do you actually sue for this? Second question then is, well, who's going to put it right? Now, the difficulty here is arising because the government has fixated on this legally meaningless phrase, the building owner. So you may have seen the successive Secretaries of State stand up in Parliament and say, building owners should do the right things, building owners should remedy their blocks. The problem is building owner is a meaningless phrase in law, and it could be a number of different people. It could be the freeholder. So normally, as you'll know, the freehold, effectively the land and the outside of the block of flats, will be owned by a freeholder, and then you'll have a leasehold interest in each of the flats. But your freeholder might just be a ground rent vehicle based offshore. We do have lots and lots of offshore trusts of varying degrees of opaque nature that own freehold land in this country. And if you are an offshore trust that owns the freehold, the odds of getting you to do anything are not great. Of course, the freeholders could actually be the leaseholders by another means. It's relatively common for leaseholders to enfranchise, so they get together and they collectively buy out the freehold interest, and then they own the company that owns the freehold. So making that company liable doesn't really help you because it's just the leaseholders by another means. And the third problem could be you might have a building owner who has no power to do anything. So quite a common modern development in residential leases is the tripartite lease, whereby you have the occupier, the leaseholder, the freeholder who grants the lease, and then you have a third party under the lease, a management company, whose job it is to perform all the freeholder tasks. So they perform all the maintenance, etc. These management companies are sometimes owned by leaseholders. They don't have to be. Sometimes they're private companies. But they're the only people under the lease with power to do the things you need to do. And that's why building owner as a phrase doesn't mean anything, because there is no concept of building owner for the purpose of regulation of standards. The third problem is this, and Ritu's touched on this. Ultimately, whoever you decide has to do this work, it is almost inevitable that the costs ultimately go back to the leaseholder. It depends, obviously, on the exact wording of each individual lease. But in broad terms, leases will generally allow the freeholder or the management company to carry out costs of repairs or costs of improvement. And whilst remedying defective cladding probably isn't a repair, because nothing's fallen out of repair yet, it's an improvement. And so you'd normally find clauses that let you charge leaseholders for that. The more common way of charging for it, I have to say, is under the insurance covenants. So you'll normally find under a long lease that the freeholder or the management company has an absolute duty to insure the building. And what happens is they go to their insurance company and the insurers say, have you got any cladding on this building? If yes, then unless you can show me you have plans to remove it, I will not insure you, or I will only insure you at a whacking great premium. So what happens, and this has been the route that the handful of FTT cases there have been on this have gone, the landlord has said, look, I have to take this cladding off and I have to charge you for it because it's actually properly considered to be a cost of insurance. If I don't do this, I can't get insurance and I have an absolute duty to insure. The third way, in broad terms, that you, as a freeholder or management company, that you can make the leaseholders pay is that most leases will have a requirement that the freeholder or management company can charge for anything that it's compelled to do by a competent authority. A competent authority means local authority or fire brigade for these purposes. So if the local authority or the fire brigade serve enforcement notices on you as a freeholder, you say, fine, thank you very much, I will comply, because failure to comply is a crime. And then you go to the clause in your lease that says, I am allowed to charge for all requirements imposed by a competent authority, and you stick the whole bill through that. It is almost inconceivable that a lease won't have at least one of those three charging mechanisms available to the freeholder or to the RMs or to the management company. Some will have three, some will have two, but it's almost inconceivable that there's a lease with no way of recovering these costs. And that is a problem because these costs are enormous. I have recently finished a case. I was acting for the local authority and we were enforcing a Housing Act 2004 notice against a landlord who was refusing to carry out the work. This is a relatively modest building. It's only got 18 flats. It's over £1 million to do the cladding and fire safety work at that building. As it happens, there actually won't be a charge made to the leaseholders there because the freeholder has managed to get money from the various government funds that are available. But 18 flats, it's only 3 stories high. It's a couple of flats above a shop, to be frank. And it's £1 million to get that done. In addition to the fact you've got to pay for the actual work itself, as Ritu's touched on, most of these affected blocks have what are colloquially called interim measures in place. So the local authority or the fire brigade come along and they say, right, you have ACM cladding or you have HPL cladding. We will close the building and make everyone homeless unless you put interim measures in place. And the interim measures generally take one of 2 forms. They're either what's called a waking watch, which is people whose job it is to walk around 24 hours a day checking there isn't a fire, or temporary fire alarm systems. And both of those are very, very expensive. And all they do is prevent the public authority closing your building. They don't actually make it safer. They're just supposed to be about buying you time to enable you to do the subsequent remedial works. But waking watch can be tens of thousands of pounds a month for 24-hour coverage for enough people to walk round. And if you don't pay these sums of money as a leaseholder, one of 2 things will happen. One, your building might get closed, in which case you will just be homeless. The other problem, and I suspect the more terrifying one for many leaseholders, is that they would risk forfeiture. So the landlord will say, look, I've issued a service charge demand. I know it's for a lot of money, but I have no choice. This is what these works cost. You haven't paid it. The lease normally only gives you 28 days to pay, something like this. So you haven't paid me the money that's due. You are therefore in breach of covenant. I'm entitled to repossess your flat. And as I'm sure you will know, with forfeiture, what happens is the lease is destroyed. It's not that the freeholder claims the lease and sells it and then you split the profits, if there are any. Your lease ceases to exist, which means that the freeholder is free to grant a new lease and sell that for a premium and keep the entire premium. It is a massive windfall for freeholders. So what do you do about this? Which I suspect is something that you guys might be more interested in talking about on this webinar. Anyone who is acting for or advising anyone in a new build block, you frankly need to be issuing your claims on a protective basis. You've only got 6 years from sign-off to do a Defective Premises Act claim. You might well need to issue and not serve the claim notice. I'm doing this for a couple of blocks at the moment. We've issued, we haven't served, just because we've got to stop time running. I mean, in January, I was at a number of meetings with leaseholders in affected blocks and just trying to get across to them. You know, their buildings were all signed off sometime between 2013 and 2014. So limitation may already have expired by the time I see them, but it was certainly expiring this year. You might well find you need to brush up on your laws on issuing but not serving claim forms. Secondly, in terms of law reform and campaigning, the government has made 2 funds of money available. One is for ACM cladding, which is Grenfell cladding, and the other is for non-ACM cladding. There are some huge problems with these funds. They're very welcome. There are some huge problems with them. One, they're not enough money. You're probably talking £15 billion or so to remedy every building in England. That was the Select Committee's figure. And the 2 funds between them come to £2 billion. Secondly, they only apply to tall buildings defined as 18 metres plus, and that's insane. If anything, some of the buildings under 18 metres are more dangerous because the building regulations have always had slightly higher standards for 18 metres plus. I know there's an argument about whether or not those standards were met in this case, but sub 18 metres is the real Wild West. And third problem is that for the second of the 2 funds, the one that was created recently, it's a first come, first serve basis. So £1 billion isn't enough, and it's a first come, first serve scramble. As to what you do down the line, as I said at the beginning, the Australians are about 5 years ahead of us on this. And the most developed scheme that the Australians have come up with And there are a couple of different schemes because it's a state issue in Australia. So different states have come up with different schemes. But the best one appears to be, I think it's New South Wales, or possibly it's Victoria. I should know which one is which, but I'm just a bit tired at the moment. Anyway, the best scheme they've come up with is where the effect of it is that the state government is paying for all of the remedial works, in exchange for which all of the, what we would recognise as leaseholders, they're strata title owners in Australia, but what we'd call them leaseholders, have to assign their rights to sue to the government. And then once the work is done and the costs have been quantified, the government is going to sue the people that it can find who are responsible for this. And that seems to me to be a good scheme for two reasons. One, it recognises the practical reality, which is that only the state has the funds needed to get this, to fix this industry. Secondly, it draws the sting out of the limitation problem, because the government doesn't really care if it gets paid now, in 5 years, or in 10 years' time, because the government of New South Wales will still be here in 10 years' time. It will still exist as an entity. It doesn't need to move house. It doesn't need to go somewhere bigger because it's got kids. So by getting it into the hands of the state, you draw the sting from that time issue that exists where you've got an individual involved. And that's something that, if anyone here has any say in policy, looking at what the Australians have done and stealing some of their ideas would be a really, really good thing to do. That's probably enough from me, so I'll be quiet again.
Thank you very much, Justin Bates, for that overview of who's responsible, who will put it right, who will pay, and really do about here in the UK, building on the examples in Australia. So next up is Andrew Dismore AM.
Thanks very much. I'll probably cover some of the same ground as Ritu and Justin, but I'm coming from a different perspective. From the perspective of the GLA, which is responsible for administering the funds in London, not deciding who gets it, but administering it, and also from the perspective of the London Fire Brigade, which is answerable to the Fire Committee, which I chair, and we work very closely together. Looking at just what's been happening in the current year, in end of January, we were told at that stage it's going to take 5 years for social housing and 9 years for private sector to be made safe. But the big problem was we didn't know who were owning the buildings that weren't getting done, particularly in the private sector, because the government was keeping it very quiet. And one of the real problems we've found all along here is the secrecy that surrounds a lot of the things that we need to know. Going on to the private sector blocks, by the end of January, beginning of February, although the money had been around since September the previous year, not a penny had been actually spent in London. And of the amount that we had, less than £50,000 had actually been allocated, never mind paid out. And what we were finding is that there were all sorts of complications that the government had put in place to apply for the private sector funds. For example, there was the state aid rule, which meant that every leaseholder in the building had to sign to say that they weren't affected by state aid rules, which was originally from the EU, that they'd had money from the EU beyond the threshold that was allowed. Now that's okay for owner-occupiers. The real problem were buy-to-let people, often where the person who bought to let wasn't even in the UK, it was a shell company from overseas or whatever. And to try and get them to sign up was very difficult, particularly as they may have a portfolio and because they may have had state aid in various forms of loans and so forth to access the money. That's now become more of a de minimis rule, but at the start it was a major problem in relation to administering the scheme. The other problem was the jumping through hoops to get the various reports underway. One of the real problems there was that a lot of the freeholders didn't actually know how to go around getting the estimates, getting the work done in the first place. They didn't have the skills to do it. And the government's done something about that, which I'll come to later on. And the third problem we came across was in relation to insurance. Now, we've heard about insurance for the blocks themselves, the freeholders taking out insurance to insure the blocks, but the problem was professional insurance for fire safety engineers. And the problem was that they simply couldn't get professional insurance because if they made a screw up, potentially the liability would be into millions. So no insurance company was prepared to underwrite their professional skills. And that was combined with the problem the London Fire Brigade had, in having enough fire safety engineers in the first place for their state side of it, never mind the private side, which the landlords had, the freeholders had to find. The problem with the London Fire Brigade was that Boris Johnson had cut 27 fire safety inspector posts when he was mayor. We got the authority from the mayor to restore those posts post Grenfell, but the problem was you couldn't recruit 27 fire safety engineers because they didn't exist, because they'd, as far as they could, taken up jobs in the private sector for vastly more money than the pay that the fire brigade could provide. They've made some progress in relation to that in terms of rehiring retired fire inspectors and so forth, but it remains a bit of a problem. So all putting all that lot together made accessing the funds for the private sector very difficult indeed. We've heard that the amounts involved, there's £400 million made available for the social sector and £200 million for the private sector. But that, as we've heard, that's just a drop in the ocean. And it doesn't, that only covers theoretically remediation of the problems of the cladding. It doesn't include, for example, retrofitting sprinkler systems, which has been one of the big issues going right back many, many years now to the Leasehold house fire, where people were killed in similar circumstances, albeit not in the same numbers by any stretch as at Grenfell, but the inquest there, the coroner made a recommendation at that time that sprinklers should be retrofitted in buildings such as these, but there's no money for that. It would be considered to be an improvement. It would have to be paid for by ultimately the leaseholders, if it's a leasehold building, or the freeholders, or whoever. And the total cost is obviously substantial. The G15 group of housing associations estimated that just for their housing association properties, it would cost £4.3 billion to fix their stuff. And it's not just leaseholders we should be concerned about. We should also be concerned about housing association and council tenants. And to put this in context, Camden, one of the boroughs which I represent on the Assembly, spent £59.6 million of its housing revenue account on fire safety. Now, that effectively is the money from rents and so forth. And to give some idea of the opportunity cost of losing £60 million, that would equate to the cost of 600 new council homes. So there's a huge knock-on effect for council tenants as well, either in terms of getting other repairs or modernisation done around, or indeed trying to do something about the overall housing crisis. So it's not just the problem of leaseholders that matters, it's also the problems facing local authorities. I took a lot of these issues up with the government and had a letter back towards the end of May from Lord Greenhouse, who's now the Minister who's been put in charge of building safety and communities. And he says that removal of unsafe ACM cladding from high-rise buildings remains a government priority. As we've heard, there's nothing for Waking Watch or the other interim measures, which amount to tens of thousands of pounds. I've mentioned the problem of the lack of fire engineers, which affects both the public and private sector, which is something they haven't really got much of an answer to. They've said they've appointed a firm of expert construction consultants to provide additional programme management capability. This was in aim to deal with the problem, which I mentioned earlier on, of building owners not actually knowing how to go around getting the estimates and designs and so forth for removal of cladding. So they are supposed to be able to support individual projects. Whether and to what extent that's become widely known amongst freeholders, I don't know. But they are there for that purpose. I've mentioned the funds already, and that's been mentioned a few times, and I've also mentioned the problems of professional insurance, and also Ritu mentioned the problems of securing buildings. Now, I contrast that with the insurer of last resort system that's put in place for people who are affected repeatedly by flood damage. The government has taken on the liability to be insured of last resort for people whose homes are flooded so regularly that they can't get insurance at anything like an affordable price. And if the government are prepared to do that for flood victims, who I suspect are in greater numbers than those in the tower blocks, then I think they ought to provide a similar system for insuring these blocks and helping people out in that way. To give you the most up-to-date figures, as of a couple of days ago, I raised this in Mayor's Question Time actually today. In London, altogether, there are 300 high-rise buildings with ACM yet to be remediated, including 197 blocks in London, and 1,700 other high-risk buildings with different types of cladding, for example, HPL or wood, the rest of the country. In London, 52 buildings are outstanding in the social housing sector and 125 in the private sector with ACM cladding, never mind the other types of cladding. And what I thought was particularly awful was the statement reported in the Times newspaper today by the chief executive of Berkeley Homes, who reported to tell the Times that the government should relax the ban on ACM on new buildings and also relax the requirement for its removal, saying it should be just a different risk assessment, which would be quite difficult to achieve. And perhaps it ought to bear in mind that Berkeley has 20 tall buildings with ACM cladding still to be fixed, and is able still to forecast profits of £500 million per year for the next 5 years. So you can see what the issue is there. Now, the government have banned ACM cladding on all buildings and are now consulting on lowering the threshold to 11-metre high buildings, but the remediation fund is still only available for 18 metres or higher. We saw in London the Worcester Park fire and the Barnet Riverside fire, where much lower buildings went up like a bonfire. And the real problem is that the crude height threshold is nowhere near sufficient to deal with these particular problems. The other issue that Greenhouse suggested at DCH, the Ministry of Housing Committee's Local Government Select Committee, was that council should consider the compulsory purchase of private sector buildings where remediation is stalled. And on the face of it, that sounds like potentially a reasonable idea, assuming the government provides the necessary funds, first of all, for the CPO, which presumably would be a relatively slow sum because it would have to be on the value of the unremediated freehold, and then also provide the money to complete remediation works, which obviously is far more than they've allocated so far. However, the problem is, are the government coming to that with clean hands, or are they trying to do what they have got a habit of doing, which is passing the buck to local government? Because if the government is saying, okay, if it's not done by the existing freeholder, then you, London Authority, go and CPO these blocks. We know how long the CPO process takes, months and months, if not years, to complete, particularly if it's not going to be done consensually, which I doubt a freeholder would agree to. And then having got that far, there's then all the months and years it takes to actually do the work as well. So that could be a bit of a pig in a poke, unless the government comes up with a very streamlined form of CPO and provides the funds, which something tells me they're unlikely to do. And what we've had is this continual problem with the government setting remediation targets to get the work done. Originally it was December last year. The most recent target was set in July last year by James Brokenshire when he was the Secretary of State, which was everything should be fixed by June this year, i.e. now. And clearly it hasn't been. And Greenhouse at the committee said, votes I accept, previous targets haven't been met. And this, i.e. the June date, wasn't really presented as a target. Well, it was then, isn't now. His latest forecast is that the works should be on site by the end of 2020, on complete in 2021. But that was an ambition as opposed to a commitment. So who knows where we're going to end up with that. Other comments from Greenhouse, which are quite interesting, the Select Committee described the cost for interim safety measures like the working watch as usurious, but no money available to help leaseholders. The naming and shaming of sites where works hadn't begun, I mentioned earlier on, they've since moved on that, but he says it's not particularly effective because of the prevalence of shell companies, He said the government should go after the beneficial owner, but tracking the beneficial owner down is not easy. Then he goes off to slag off the beneficial owners who don't take action, saying, I think what we need to recognise is that these people should be pariahs in terms of future business in the country. We cannot allow these people to have a good name if they are the beneficial owner of a building 3 years on from Grenfell that still has unsafe cladding. Fine. Do something about it. Other issues that have come up post the virus are also quite serious, in that some residents have been refusing access to the fire service to conduct their inspections of buildings because they're frightened that the fire service will be spreading coronavirus, which I suppose is an understandable fear. But it does mean the Section 7.2D visits, which are there to check up on, for example, the waking watch, who wakes the waking watch if they've muddled off. The fire brigade's job is to go around and do that sort of thing. If they can't get in, they can't really do a proper review of that sort of thing. The fire brigade's actually been making great progress since Grenfell, despite the coronavirus, and trying to improve its response. Obviously, the Phase 1 report was very critical of the fire brigade, as was the inspection report, which came out at the end of last year and ultimately led to the early retirement of the then fire chief. We now have somebody who is, I think, an excellent guy, Andy Rowe, who's new fire commissioner, is making a real difference. They produced a transformation plan, which is very ambitious. The timetable's been knocked back because of coronavirus, but they are making real progress in producing the new kit that they need to buy. For example, the new turntable ladders, higher ones, are starting to come on stream now this year. They're looking at greater use of drones, for example, delivering smokers to people who are trapped in buildings. There's a program for replacement of the radios and the breathing apparatus sets. Some training has had to be suspended, but critical training like incident command is still going ahead, which is one of the criticisms that the brigade faced. There's a lot going on there. They're having real problems, though, devising a firefighting system for tall buildings, which at the same time protects the safety of firefighters. They have come up with a program. I went to see an exercise at a tall building where they tried it out in February before the virus hit, which is potentially better for the people living in the top floors, but it's potentially also dangerous for the firefighters because it does mean them going into buildings without their breathing apparatus sets being operated until they get much higher up in the building, and that means they are potentially exposed to dangerous chemicals. So that may be coming into us the end of the year. There's a lot of negotiations going on around that. So there's a lot of progress going on there. And then there's the parliamentary developments, which is the fire safety bill in committee this next week, actually. The fire brigade are looking at promoting particular issues with the fire safety bill. It's one of the two bills that we're looking at. The first is that the risk is that the regulations behind the bill will be staggered in their introduction according to height, and that will create loopholes for developers which they'll be able to exploit. There are no clear definitions for key terms, particularly things like buildings, what's a building, and common parts, what's a common part. And another thing which is a real problem are flat front doors. The fire brigade, London Fire Brigade, estimate there are 2.5 million doors across 7,000 residential high-rises in London, and not all of them meet fire safety standards, and there's no real clear standard being set, nor power for the fire brigade to inspect them because they're not considered to be part of common parts. And we know that one of the real things that happens is that in council blocks, when somebody buys a leasehold, they often change the front door, and there's no guarantee that what they've changed it to will be sufficiently fire resistant. And we saw that, for example, in Grenfell. So those are three key asks that the fire brigade have as the bill progresses. The other bill, which is coming out, we're hoping to see sometime in the next week or two, and we'll have to have a look at that and see what that comes out to look like and what changes need to be made to that. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that very comprehensive overview of the current political situation and really moving this forward. So first, if we could have Sally Hughes present her question to the panel. We'll do this in threes. So first be...
Yes, sorry.
No, that's fine. So first Sally Hughes, then Mervyn Jones, and then I have a question that was sent in from Georgie Helm.
Hi, thanks. I think that was one of the most erudite and detailed exposition by 3 panelists I've ever heard, actually. I've been looking at issues to do with leaseholding in connection with another piece of work. Something that's occurred to me in the past of these COVID-19 webinars that the Society's been holding, and it strikes me as very important now, is that some of the kind of justice issues have been alluded to, or clearly. We've got all the complications that Justin and Andrew mentioned about split liability, shell companies, but various evasions of responsibility, and the underlying position of the state. And I thought during the David Lammy session, which we had a couple of weeks ago, that as a society, perhaps, sorry, you've asked me to start my video and I thought I did. Okay, got rid of the box. That we ought to be looking at this as a justice issue as well. I thought when we started, oh yes, the nationalisation thing, the taking over of the claim, one of the Australian solutions, that kind of thing, and the compulsory purchase, yes, that's a possibility. But what we've lost in our justice system is any real direction of where the state needs to help individuals. And we've also added a lot of cost on, because when I saw I did some time ago, the original committee minutes for is it Kensington and Chelsea, they were actually only saving about £200,000 on changing the cladding that had already been planned for Grenfell Tower. So why, I don't understand how these costs have, I don't understand completely how these costs have escalated and how they redound so badly. And I wonder how much role the justice system is playing in this to ramp up these costs. You don't have to give the answer right now, but would it be a good idea to look at a different form of legal aid in these big cases? They include the flooding issues, the lack of real state action to put right things where it's difficult to pin down traditional legal liability.
Thank you, Sally. If anyone else has a question, we'll take these 3 and then we'll open it up for more questions afterwards. We have until 6:30, and if there aren't any questions that go until then, that's fine. But this is a really important topic, so we'd really encourage everyone to participate if they'd like to. So next is Mervyn Jones.
Hi there, thanks Rosalee. I'm a long-standing LHG member. I'm one of Andrew's constituents, and I'm chair of a small housing association in North London, which has 10 blocks with cladding. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned, and I'd like to comment on, is the fact that most of these are mixed tenure. So there'll be maybe 25% shared ownership, and then the rest of the building may be private rent and owner-occupied leaseholds, which of course adds to the complexity. My second question emerges from analysis of the Building Safety Fund really in the last couple of days. There are supposed to be about 450 entities that have applied to the fund. None of them are housing associations, because the detailed terms of the fund are that if a housing association, as opposed to a private entity, applies, it has to essentially declare itself insolvent. It has to demonstrate that it cannot afford to do the works. So my association will not be applying to the fund on that basis. What we're anxiously awaiting, and I suspect others on the call would be wanting to look at, is the new prospectus to help leaseholders avoid having to pay. And so we're facing, at my little outfit, having to pay for the remediation of the rented parts of our buildings, but seeking funding to pay for the leasehold parts, the shared ownership parts, so that our leaseholders don't pay. I guess that's specifically for Andrew, who clearly has looked at these regulations in detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the final question is from Georgie Hull, who sent a series of questions, and I'll read one of them out. One is it reasonable to expect the freeholder to pay any proportion of all or some of the costs? And if so, how can we ensure this happens? So if I could start with Ritu to answer some or all of these questions.
Well, I'm absolutely not a legal expert, so I cannot comment on any of the legal aspects. But if I were to take Georgie's question from what I have experienced in my discussions with many leaseholders, the answer seems to be a clear no. Most leases will will have a clause in it which passes these costs on to leaseholders. So, I have not heard of a single case where the lease has allowed or led to the freeholder paying. Again, I'm not a legal expert, but in terms of shared ownership, this is again a huge problem. Because obviously we have to wait for the details of this prospectus to come out, which is in, I think it's happening in the beginning of July. But shared owners are extremely scared. At the moment, they are being told that even if they own 25% of the property, they are liable for 100% of the costs for fixing. And again, this is another place where the law on leasehold and shared ownership lets us down very badly. Yeah, and those are my comments.
Thank you. If we could have Justin speak next.
Yeah, okay, let's try. I was making notes that was kind of long, so I'll try and answer all three. Sally, you asked two things. You asked about the cost of cladding and how it got so expensive. Then you asked about the legal aid style scheme. Cost of cladding, you've got to remember it's a couple of things. One, it's the cladding itself. Two, you generally find once you take this defective cladding off that there are some massive other problems with these buildings. So you generally find that once you get the cladding off, you find there are no fire breaks or the fire doors don't work, etc. So that adds up the costs. There is a national scaffolding shortage at the moment because there are large numbers of tower blocks that are having to be scaffolded to have all their cladding taken off. So scaffolding currently costs an absolute arm and a leg. And then there are professional fees on top of it. It is generally anywhere between, I would say, 12 and 20% of the cost is professional fees, surveyors and others to oversee the work. That's where it just adds up and adds up and adds up. A sort of a broader question about legal aid, or a legal aid style scheme. I would be surprised if there was anyone in this webinar who was not in favour of a more generous legal aid scheme, and I'd be quite surprised as well if there was people in this webinar who weren't in favour of some kind of state support for the costs that innocent leaseholders find themselves facing. I mean, the nature of the support and how you recover it is a more difficult question, but I would have thought the principle wouldn't be that controversial among Labour circles. But I'm generally in favour of the state having relatively generous schemes to help people who own valuable assets, like flats, because ultimately you can always put a charge over it and get some of it back. I've always thought you should have a generous legal aid scheme that extends to most homeowners, for example, because ultimately the state will get repaid. Mervyn asks about mixed tenure blocks. Yes, I agree, they're an absolute nightmare. In particular, as I think Andrew touched on, the problems of getting access to do retrofitting and sprinklers. So there's a High Court case from about 2 months ago that I lost called Peachnick and Oxford City Council, where I was trying to create for Oxford a right to go into their right to buy flats and force people to accept sprinklers, because we can do it for our secure tenants without any real difficulty. But High Court said I can't do it for my right to buy leaseholders. Yeah, it's a big problem. You could do with a general tidying up fire safety act that confers a number of rights on particularly social landlords. Rights of access to do work would definitely be one. And then Georgie's question, I think part of the problem is, it's who is the freeholder? If the freeholder is an offshore trust fund, you can think it's as reasonable as you like to expect them to pay. It isn't going to happen. If the freeholder is just the leaseholders by another vehicle, then it doesn't matter how reasonable it is. They haven't got any money. So there's no point imposing the obligation on them. Where the government could do more, and frankly could do a hell of a lot more, is it has relationships with the big house builders. And if it were to say to them, come on, Berkeley Group, I know how much you like Help to Buy. We're going to exclude you from it unless you take steps to remedy these existing buildings. That would have a hell of a big impact. And I don't see why you can't exclude them from Help to Buy. They have no right to Help to Buy monies. There's nothing wrong, it seems to me, with the government saying we will only make this ex gratia funding scheme, will only make it available to people who've proven themselves to be good corporate citizens. I mean, that's where, if you really want to have a short-term improvement that doesn't cost the public any money, that's the kind of thing you could be doing.
Thank you very much, Justin. And now, Andrew?
Well, just following up on that last point, the problem with the naughty landlords is they're not particularly bothered about the ex gratia scheme because they'll get the money out the leaseholders. So it's a bit of a circular argument. For the other points, Sally talked about justice. Well, let's remember that for phase 2 of the Grenfell inquiry, those who are most likely responsible have been given immunity from prosecution for any evidence that they give at the inquiry, both as individuals and as companies. So that's going to make it that much harder for the police to get to the bottom of the story, but to actually find the evidence to prosecute. So that's quite serious. Very much agree with what Justin says about legal aid. But in the end, if you're going to have a class action or something like that, who are you going to sue? Because there are all these different companies and they're all in different blocks. So it becomes very difficult except to try and establish some sort of principle. But because we have this system of confrontation in the courts, the adversarial system, it's difficult to work out how you could actually do that, I think. Mervyn made the point about mixed tenure. Well, the problem with mixed tenure isn't just in relation to fire safety, it's a general problem whenever any substantial works need to be done on any block. Just ordinary maintenance or painting the outside or whatever, there's always an issue between leaseholders who are concerned about the cost. They always seem to be astronomical costs, no matter what it is, and the council tenants who pay for it through their housing revenue account and want to get the work done. So there's always these tensions, and what we've seen with the fire safety issues is that really brought them to the fore. And you get all these different problems as well with buy-to-let. You've got people who are may not even have a proper tenure, may not have a proper lease, or may only have a license, or may even be occupying illegally. It can get very, very complicated indeed, and there's no really easy answer to that. As far as housing associations being excluded, well, I think the problem there is very similar to those of local authorities. As I explained, Camden, they've had to spend £60 million out of the housing revenue account, which is effectively tenants' money on remediation. It's a big problem, and the real answer is the only way it can be sorted out is by the government recognising what the total cost of this is going to be, not trying to do it in penny packets, £1 million penny packets, which is what they're doing now. They came up with the original 600 million, which is 400 million and 200 million, and now they come up with an extra billion, but it's still nowhere near enough. And until they come up with the money that's enough, it's always going to be robbing Peter to pay Paul. And the problem with making it first come, first served, on one hand, that's the advantage of first come, first served, is that it effectively puts pressure on the freeholders to get on with it in case that they miss out. But on the other hand, they may not be in a position to do so for the reasons I gave earlier on, and they lose out for unfair reasons.
Thank you very much. So we have Dermot McKibben, who has put his hand up, and another question from Georgie Holm is, one second. Is the residential tribunal a good way of challenging management companies who may have followed due process, and how does it work? I understand it is hard as depends on individual leases and situations, but issues, e.g. around lack of communication, lack of communication, potential inadequate fire safety reports. Another question that she's sent in is it true that management companies take a huge percentage of costs of overall works? I heard 20% is common. And if we could go to Dermot.
Thank you, Rosalee. My question is, obviously there are lots of flats being built at the moment in London, and are they fireproof? And I think I read somewhere that the mayor has taken planning powers in the London mayor of large sites to make it a condition of planning approval to deal with fire safety issues. And could the panel say more about that? And is that power available to other mayors outside London? And is it actually being used? That's all. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll go in reverse order now. So Andrew, if you could on these issues first.
Well, dealing with Dermot's point about are the flats fireproof? Well, the government have banned ACM cladding, so to that extent things are better. But it's only when the new legislation goes all the way through both bills that I think we can actually say that in relation to new construction. One thing that is important though is that new buildings do have to have sprinkler systems fitted. There's no requirement to retrofit, but new buildings are expected to have them, which is a real benefit because they are very effective. You may see the initials FSS, fire suppression systems, is the posh name for a sprinkler system because there are different ones which operate in a slightly different way. I think what you're talking about, Dermot, is the London plan, which is still in draft form. For the first time, the mayor is trying to do something about fire safety. There's an argument from the inspector about whether, in fact, those sort of issues belong in the fire safety or whether they're belong in the London plan, which is planning, as opposed to belonging in the building regulations. So until the London plan is finally approved, and it hasn't been because it's backwards and forwards, it's now with the Secretary of State, I think, now, who sent it back with various comments to the mayor. It won't be actually formally in place. At the moment, it's still part of building regulations, which obviously has to be complied with. And it's only as building regulations change that that takes effect. But we have tried to put stuff in relation to fire safety into the London plan, both in terms of buildings and in terms of, for example, access to fire service, because one of the big problems you've got is getting the fire trucks sufficiently close to these tall buildings because of everything that's built up around the bottoms of them. So that's work in progress, I think. In relation to the tribunal, I'll leave that one to Justin, who's probably got more experience of that than I have. As far as management companies taking a percentage of the works, yes, they do. It does vary, but Ritu's probably got a better idea of that than I have as well. That's me.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So if Justin can speak now.
Yeah, I have nothing to say to Dermot, I'm afraid, which is a shame. Nice to see you again. But I'm afraid I don't know anything about what the mayor's up to, so I can't help you on that one. Georgie's two questions. I would not be rushing off to the FTT, is my honest answer. The problem is that most leases, although it will always turn on each individual lease, most leases are going to have some route by which these costs can be recovered. And the tribunal doesn't really, it can't change your obligations under your lease. It can only tell you what the leases say. So there have been 4 or 5 reasonably high profile challenges in the FTT where leaseholders have been trying to avoid paying the cost of these fire safety works, and they've all lost. And they've lost on everything because, frankly, leases aren't set up to enable leaseholders to avoid paying for costs on buildings. Whether that's fair or not is a different question, but they're not set up to create unfunded obligations on freeholders or on management companies. I think you need to be slightly careful about what you mean by do management companies take a share of the cost of the work. So management companies, if you're talking about people like Savills or Firstport or Rendell and Rittner, like the big resi management companies in England, who are acting as agents for the freeholder or for the management company. They charge a fee for their work, and commonly on major works projects, that fee is expressed as a percentage of the cost of the project, with the idea being that a bigger project will obviously take more of their time. What's a reasonable fee is something the tribunal can rule on, but broadly, anything between sort of seven would be pretty generous. I would say that the going rate range is sort of anywhere from 12.5 to 20, depending on the complexity of the work and what they're dealing with. If they're just taking a kickback, that's unlawful. And if you've got someone doing that, the FTT is not your friend. The police are your friend for that, because that's just corrupt. But you need to distinguish between a legitimate charge for work associated with a project, and as I say, a percentage of the fee is the usual way of doing it, and that's the way the RICS say it should be done. And that is fine. Kickbacks, not fine.
Thanks, Justin. And Ritu?
Yeah, I don't really have much to add, just on in terms of the fees of management companies. All I just want to add is that if a building is eligible for the Building Safety Fund or the ACM fund, you should know that those managing agent fees will be covered as part of the overall project cost. So make sure you keep those bills, etc., because you need to send them to the GLA for payment. That's it.
Thank you. So we have a couple of other questions. One is from Thomas Webb, and I'm just going to summarize the key point, which is, could companies who provided and manufactured the cladding and local authorities who approved the negligent cladding foot the bill for the removal of that? And I'll read out Tom Hode's question, which is, it feels like we're kicking the can down the road for the government ultimately paying the full cost of remediation and opting for the drip feeding funding and extending the woes of leaseholders over a period of years. This is a question specifically for Justin. What are the prospects of judicial review or class action lawsuits against the government for the systemic failure of regulations and the complete lack of testing of these types of materials? I have some, albeit limited, sympathy with the builders using these materials. Indeed, ACM cladding systems were explicitly approved by the NHBC pre-Grenfell. So those are the two questions. We could potentially go to Justin first.
Okay. Right, I found those questions. They turn up in a chat box, so I can read them properly. Tom Hode, I'll answer yours first. Yeah, we are kicking the can down the road. And frankly, we're kicking the can down the road, hoping that there isn't another fire and people don't die. And we might be lucky. I mean, I sincerely hope we are. But let's all be frank about what we are doing. That is the risk that the government is taking. And you may or may not think that is acceptable. I personally don't. Prospects of some sort of judicial review style claim against the government for lack of testing. I don't think there's much real danger of that, to be honest. The amount of money you would need to bring that claim is eye-watering, because the level of expert evidence you'd need would be huge. It probably wouldn't be a judicial review, because you'd want to have proper examination of the evidence and testing, etc. There's if you're interested in this, there's a professor at Oxford called Professor Sue Bright, and she runs a blog examining housing issues after Grenfell. Sue has sketched out what the outline of a claim against the government might look like, and she's sketched it out trying to do it under human rights legislation. It's plausible. It's a plausible claim that she sketches out. you would be taking a massive risk as a private individual to get involved in that, because the costs involved are mind-blowing. If you lost it, the costs against you would be mind-blowing. If you won it, the government would obviously appeal. It's a Supreme Court trip, and it's who wants to spend the next 10 years of their life doing that, is the question. Thomas Webb's question about the companies who manufacture and provide this stuff. Problem's going to be, what's your claim against them? So you are a company that makes steel. You have no contractual relationship with the leaseholders who are living in the buildings, or you're a company that makes cladding. You have no contractual relationship with anyone in these buildings. You have a contractual relationship with the builder, I suspect, although I would be surprised, actually. I suspect you've actually got intermediate contractual relationships and chains intended to protect you from this sort of circumstance. But your builder's probably gone bust, because you normally build through a shell company. A negligence claim against a manufacturer, got to show they owe a duty of care. The trend since Caparo and Dickman has been to limit the scope of new duties of care. I'm not sure I fancy my chances of winning that below the Supreme Court. What else are you going to bring? Defective Premises Act claim? Possibly, but 6-year limitation from sign-off, so that's not going to help you. I don't think you've got much to look at in there. I think you've got an interesting question for undergraduates in their essays. I don't think I've got one that I'd really tell someone to put their money on.
Thank you. If we could go to Ritu now.
Oh, I have absolutely nothing to add. I agree completely with what Justin said. I mean, yeah, the chances of all of this are absolutely minimal. And but the point is that that's why we are here. We don't need the can kicking down the road. And you know, the solution is one of the public getting outraged, because the only way to fix this problem is money. And it's not money that we have or we should be asked to pay for. So, you know, it has to be a public campaign which forces the government to do a U-turn and realize that ultimately it is up to the state to fix a problem which is actually a state failure of regulations.
Thank you. And Andrew, and then after this, we'll have, as some more questions, we will just have a quick see if any of our panelists want to give closing remarks. Okay, well, first of all, we're kicking the can down the road. Let's remember that since Grenfell, there have been other fires. There's the Worcester Park fire I mentioned earlier on, the Barking Riverside fire I mentioned earlier on, not in tall blocks, but just as destructive. And there's also the fire in the student accommodation in Manchester, again, enormously destructive. And going pre-Grenfell, there wasn't just Lacknell House where people were killed, there were other similar fires due to cladding elsewhere in the country. So Grenfell isn't the beginning, it's sort of stuck in the middle, and it's obviously the worst because earlier lessons weren't learned either. As far as liability is concerned, the real problem is the fragmentation of the inspection regime. A lot of this, as things stand, you've got developers marking their own homework because they appoint their own responsible person. For anyone to try and inspect cladding, for example, it's very difficult because it's not just the material, it's how it's installed as well. And one of the problems we've seen at Grenfell is it wasn't installed properly, which enabled the cladding and the space between the cladding and the building to act as a chimney and force the fire straight up the outside of the building. If it had proper fire breaks in, it may not have happened that way. We have seen fires in other tower blocks where it's been well contained. So to try and work out who was responsible, whether it was the local authority or whether it's just so many parties, it makes it very, very difficult. And hopefully the Grenfell Phase 2 inquiry, whenever it reports in several years' time, will try and untangle some of that and give some markers as to how that should be looked further ahead. And again, I hope that the legislation coming through Parliament over the next year will provide some answers in relation to that as well, though whether it will be sufficiently clear remains to be seen. I think that's all I've got to add for those points. Thanks. Thank you. Do any of our speakers wish to have any closing comments before we conclude the discussion? Start with Andrew.
All I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you. Ritu?
Yeah, I'd just like to reiterate what I said before, that, you know, all of this makes for very grim listening, especially for leaseholders. That, you know, unless you are very, very lucky, there is very little protecting you from the costs and the legal liabilities of fixing this yourself. So, you know, the only solution is public outrage and campaigning to make sure that the government does a U-turn before another fire happens. Thanks.
Thank you. And Justin?
There is nothing I can usefully add.
Okay, well, I'd really like to thank all three of our speakers. You've done an excellent job and given a really in-depth analysis of the question, leaseholders and cladding, unresolved issues 3 years after Grenfell's calamitous fire. Thank you all, and I hope you have a good evening.